Jack Bigham's hands stopped moving. The balance wheel he'd been adjusting, smaller than a shirt button, delicate as a spider's web, hung suspended between tweezers. Through his jeweler's loop, he could see his father standing in the doorway of the shop, holding an envelope.
Don't say it,
Jack whispered. His father set the envelope on the workbench. You knew it was coming. Jack set down the tweezers. 6 years he'd spent at this bench. 6 years learning to see what others couldn't, the microscopic gap, where a gear tooth had worn thin, the barely there wobble in a hairspring. His father had taught him that precision wasn't about strength. It was about patience, about making something broken whole again. The draft notice lay between them like a grenade. I fix things, Dad. I don't break them. I know. I've never even fired a gun. You'll learn. His father's voice cracked. You'll learn, and you'll come home, and we'll fix watches together again. Jack picked up the envelope. His hands, steady enough to thread a hairspring, were shaking. What did you do before soldier? Drill Sergeant Kowalski's voice could strip paint. He moved down the line of recruits like a shark through shallow water. Farm work, sir. Good. Next. Dock worker, sir. Good. You. He stopped in front of Jack. What about you? Watch repair, sir. The barracks exploded. Someone whistled. Another recruit, a big kid from Nebraska, shouted, Did he say watches? Kowalski didn't smile, but his eyes did. Watches. Well, son, the Germans don't tell time. They tell bullets. He leaned closer. Hope you can fix yourself when one tears through you. The laughter followed Jack everywhere. In the mess hall, someone would tap their wrist and mouth tick-tock. On the firing range, when Jack squinted at distant targets, a voice would call out, Need a magnifying glass, jeweler? Jack never responded. His father had taught him. Results speak louder than anger. But at night, lying on his bunk while others snored, Jack stared at the ceiling and made calculations. Trajectory. Windage. Drop. The same precision that fixed a watch could aim a rifle. He knew this, the way he knew the feel of a worn gear tooth, certain mechanical true. He just had to prove it. Corporal Davies threw his rifle into the snow. 6 inches! The damn scope is off by 6 goddamn inches! Lieutenant Harrow looked up from the map. Use your iron sights. At 500 yards, are you serious? Supply says 2 weeks for replacements. 2 weeks. Davies kicked at the snow. How many of us you think will be alive in 2 weeks? No one answered. They all knew the math. The Germans had dug into every ridge, every tree line. Machine guns that fired so fast you couldn't count the shots. Mortars that could drop a shell through your roof. The Scope's M73 B1 models that fogged in the cold, cracked under recoil, lost 0 after a dozen shots were useless. Jack sat in the corner of the ruined farmhouse cellar they'd occupied, his rifle across his knees. He'd been studying the Scope for an hour, not touching it, just looking. Private Torres dropped down beside him. What, just staring at tick-tock? Problems. Yeah. See any solutions? Jack unscrewed the mounting rings, lifted the Scope free, held it up to the kerosene lamp. Torres leaned in. What's wrong with it? Everything. Jack rotated the Scope slowly. The reticles shifted, focus rings frozen, lenses separated from the housing. So it's trash. No. Jack set it down carefully. It's just built wrong. Torres laughed. You gonna tell that to the U.S. Army? Jack didn't answer. He was already looking at the corner of the cellar, where someone had thrown a broken German microscope into a pile of medical waste. You want the what? Medic Chen looked up from packing bandages, his breath fogging in the frozen air. The microscope, Jack said. The broken one. It's trash, Bigham. Objective lens is cracked to hell. I don't need that lens. I need the others. Chen shrugged and went back to his packing. Help yourself. Just don't come crying to me when you cut yourself on the glass. Jack pulled the microscope from the pile. German-made, Zeiss. The main lens was ruined, but the eyepiece assembly 3 precision-ground lenses, each smaller than a dime, was intact. In his hands, they felt like possibility. Back in the cellar, Torres watched him work. "What are you doing?" "Building a scope." "Out of a broken microscope." "Out of these." Jack held up the lenses to the light. "And this?" He gestured at a pile of spent German 88mm shell casings outside. "And whatever else I can find." Torres stared at him. "You're insane." "Maybe." "No, I mean actually insane. Like they're gonna put you in a hospital insane." Jack picked up a hacksaw. "You gonna help or just talk?" The work took 3 days. Jack cut a 6-inch section from an 88mm casing, filing the edges until they were smooth as glass. He mounted the Zeiss lenses inside, using thread from a medical kit, adjusting each one by fractions of a millimeter. For the reticle, the crosshairs, he used a strand of copper wire from a field telephone stretched so tight it hummed when he plucked it. On the second night, Davies wandered over, watched for a minute. "That's never gonna work." Jack didn't look up. "Probably not." "Then why bother?" "Because doing nothing definitely won't work." Davies grunted and walked away. But an hour later, he came back with a piece of scrap steel. "For the mounting bracket," he muttered. "Don't say I never gave you nothing." By the third night, others were watching too. Not helping, just watching. The cellar filled with cigarette smoke and silence as Jack worked by lamplight, his fingers moving with the same precision he'd used on watch gears back in Kansas. Torres broke the silence. "What if it doesn't work?" Jack threaded the final screw into place. "Then I'll fix it until it does." He lifted the rifle. The homemade scope looked ridiculous. Brass tube scarred and dented steel mounting bracket bent by hand, the whole assembly adding an awkward pound. Someone in the corner laughed. Jack ignored him. He brought the scope to his eye, aimed at a nail in the far wall. The nail jumped into focus so sharp he could see the rust on the head. "Holy hell," he whispered. Jack slipped out of camp after midnight. He climbed Red Hill alone, carrying a sack of old helmets and shell casings. At the top, he set up targets at measured distances, 200 yards, 400, 600. Then he lay prone in the snow rifle, rested on a log, and began to shoot. The first shot at 200 yards punched through a helmet dead center. The second at 400 rang a shell casing like a bell. At 600 yards, he put 3 rounds through a space the size of a dinner plate. But 800 yards, that was the test. An abandoned German ammunition box barely visible in the moonlight. Jack adjusted for wind elevation drop. He controlled his breathing the way his father had taught him, to steady his hands, slow in through the nose hold, slow out through the mouth. Squeeze. The rifle cracked. 4 seconds of silence. Then the box exploded in a puff of frozen earth. Jack sat back against the log, his heart hammering. Not from fear. From recognition. This was what precision felt like. This was what happened when you built something right when every piece fit exactly where it should. He climbed down as dawn broke, the jury-rigged scope still mounted on his rifle. He didn't tell anyone about the test. Not yet. Results first. Words later. Lieutenant Harrow spread the map across a crate in the cellar. 20 soldiers crowded in their faces, hollowed by hunger and exhaustion. Intelligence reports 3 Panzer IVs dug in at Bois de Laune, 5 miles northeast. They're picking off supply convoys, killed 11 men yesterday. Silence. Everyone knew what came next. Shermans can't advance. Forest is too thick. Artillery can't target them through the canopy. Harrow looked up. Command wants us to take them out on foot. More silence. Davies stared at his boots. Torres crossed himself. On foot meant satchel charges. Bazookas. Getting close enough to see the faces of the men you were about to kill, or who were about to kill you. If we had working scopes, Davies said quietly, we could engage from distance, target crew when they're exposed, Maybe hit a fuel tank. We don't have working scopes. I do. Every head turned. Jack stood in the back corner, almost invisible in the shadows. Harrow squinted. Bigham. I have a scope that works, sir. Someone snorted. Someone else whispered, the junk scope. Harrow set down his pencil. The scopes are all fogged or broken. Private. Yes, sir, but I built a new one. The whispers turned to laughter. Torres, trying to help, said, He's serious, Lieutenant. I've seen... He made it from trash, a voice interrupted. I saw it. Looks like something a kid built in shop class. The laughter got louder. Harrow held up a hand for quiet, but he was smiling too. Bigham, I appreciate the initiative, but we can't bet lives on a homemade... Then bet one life, sir. Mine. The laughter stopped. Jack stepped forward into the lamplight. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed, but his voice never wavered. Give me a spotter and a position. If I can't take out a tank, court-martial me. But if I can, you don't send 20 men to die tomorrow. Harrow studied him. In the lieutenant's eyes, Jack could see the calculation: one soldier with a questionable weapon versus a platoon assault with guaranteed casualties. How far can you shoot with that thing? Tested to 800 yards, sir. Consistently. The Panzers are at 1 on 200. Jack didn't blink. Then I'll shoot at 1/200. Davies shook his head slowly. Jesus, Bigham. Even with a factory scope. I'm aware, Corporal. Harrow looked at the map. At Jack. Back at the map. Finally, he exhaled long and slow. If you miss, we storm the position at dawn. Yes, sir. And Bigham. Sir. If that scope fails and gets you killed, I'm writing your mother a very apologetic letter. Jack allowed himself a small smile. Tell her I was fixing something, sir. She'll understand. They moved through the forest in darkness. Jack, Lieutenant Harrow, and radioman Kowalski. 3 miles through frozen hell, temperature 8 degrees, wind cutting through every layer of clothing. No one spoke. The forest was silent, except for the crunch of their boots in snow and the distant rumble of artillery to the south. At 5:45, they reached the ridge overlooking Bois de Laine. Harrow glassed the tree line with binoculars. There, south edge, see the netting. Jack looked through his scope. At first, just trees and shadow. Then shapes emerged. The angular hull of a Panzer IV, the long 75mm gun, and beside it, barely visible, 2 German soldiers moving near the rear. Range, Jack asked. Harrow checked his map. 240 yards, maybe 250. Kowalski whistled softly. This is insane. Jack settled into position, prone on frozen ground rifle, rested on a log. Through the scope, he watched the Germans. They were refueling, carrying jerry cans from a hidden cache. One set a can down near the Panzer's rear deck and unscrewed the cap. Gasoline. Volatile. Exposed. What are you waiting for? Harrow whispered. The right moment. Because this wasn't just about proving his scope worked. It was about proving that precision mattered. That building something right, even when everyone said it was impossible, could save lives. One of the Germans lifted the jerry can, tilting it to pour fuel into the filler port. Gasoline sloshed out, catching the early light. Bigham, Harrow hissed. They're finishing. You've got maybe... Jack's finger touched the trigger. His father's voice clear, as if he were standing beside him. Patience. Make it right. The German tipped the can further. More gasoline spilled across the deck. Now. Jack squeezed. The rifle kicked. Through the scope he saw nothing, just trees and shadow, and the tiny figures moving in slow motion. 12 seconds of silence. Then the German jerked backward. The jerry can tumbled. Gasoline splashed across metal. A flash, small orange, hungry. It caught the spilled fuel, raced along the deck, found the open filler port. The Panzer exploded. Not Hollywood style. Real. ugly. The ammunition cooked off, boom, 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 each detonation tearing the tank apart from inside. The turret lifted into the air, flipped, crashed down 20 feet away. Black smoke boiled upward, thick and oily. Harrow stared through his binoculars, mouth open. "Sweet Jesus!" Kowalski shouted into the radio. "Tango 1 destroyed, repeat, Tango 1 destroyed. Single shot 1, 200+ yards." Jack worked the bolt, ejected the spent casing, chambered another round. "There are still 2 more," he said quietly. Harrow turned to look at him. Really look at him. "Bigham, what the hell did you just—" "There are still 2 more tanks, sir." And in that moment, lying in frozen mud with a scope built from trash and belief, Jack Bigham understood something fundamental. They'd laughed at the watchmaker. But precision doesn't care about laughter. It only cares about being right. The smoke was still rising when Jack chambered his 3rd round. Through the scope, he watched the 2nd Panzer. The crew had heard the first explosion. Everyone for 5 miles had heard it. 2 soldiers appeared from behind the camouflage netting, craning their necks toward the burning wreckage of their sister tank. "They're spooked," Harrow whispered. "They'll button up any second." Jack's crosshair settled on a fuel drum stacked beside the Panzer's track. "Not if I'm fast." He didn't wait for permission. The rifle cracked. The drum ruptured. Diesel poured across the frozen ground, black and slick. The Germans scrambled, shouting in a language Jack didn't understand, but whose panic needed no translation. One of them dropped a lit cigarette. The fire spread slower than gasoline. Diesel needs heat, but when it caught hungry. Flames crawled under the Panzer's belly, found the engine compartment, ignited oil and grease, and everything the Germans had used to keep the machine running through the brutal winter. "Target 2 mobility kill," Kowalski said into the radio. His voice had lost its skepticism. Now it carried something else. Awe, maybe, or fear. The 3rd Panzer's crew didn't wait to see what happened next. Through his scope, Jack watched them abandon their positions, scrambling into the forest like roaches when a light switched on. They left the tank behind, hatches open, engines still running. Harrow lowered his binoculars slowly. 3 tanks, 3 shots. Christ, Bigham, you just did what would have taken us 2 days and cost us 20 men. Jack said nothing. He was staring at the homemade scope, at the brass tube and salvaged lenses and copper wire crosshair that had somehow impossibly worked exactly as he'd calculated it would. His hands were shaking now. Not from the cold, from the realization of what precision actually meant in this place at this moment. It meant the difference between life and death, not just for him, for everyone. They hiked back to camp in silence. By the time they reached the ruined farmhouse, word had already spread. Kowalski had been on the radio the whole way back, and radios had big mouths. The entire company was waiting. Jack stepped into the cellar, rifle slung over his shoulder, scope still mounted. Every conversation stopped. 20 pairs of eyes tracked him across the room. Davies was the first to speak. "Is it true 3 tanks?" Jack nodded once. "With that?" Davies pointed at the scope. "With that thing you made out of junk?" "Yes." Someone in the back, the same soldier who'd laughed 3 days ago, said quietly, "Holy shit." Then they were all around him, asking questions Jack didn't know how to answer. How far was the shot? How did you calculate the drop? Where did you learn to shoot like that? Can you make another scope? Can you teach us? Lieutenant Harrow pushed through the crowd. "All right, back up. Give the man room to breathe." He waited until the cellar had quieted, then turned to Jack. "Captain wants to see you. Battalion HQ 0800 tomorrow. Bring the rifle." "Am I in trouble, sir?" Harrow almost smiled. "No, Private. I don't think you're in trouble." That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, while others snored and muttered in their dreams. His mind kept replaying the shot, the moment the trigger broke, the 12 seconds of silence, the explosion that proved precision could win battles. But something else gnawed at him. Something he couldn't name at first. Then he realized guilt. He'd killed men today, Not in the chaos of close combat where everything happened too fast to think. He'd killed them from nearly a mile away, watching through magnified glass as they burned. He'd seen their faces, seen them run, seen them die. Torres stirred on the bunk below. "You awake, Tick-Tock?" "Yeah." "Can't sleep either, huh?" "No." Silence. Then Torres said, "You saved lives today. You know that, right? If we'd stormed those Panzers on foot, half of us wouldn't be here right now." Jack didn't respond. Because Torres was right, and that should have made him feel better. But it didn't. It just made him feel like a watchmaker who'd learned to break things instead of fix them. "My old man always said," Torres continued, "that war doesn't make you a killer. It just shows you what kind of killer you already were. Some guys like it. Get hungry for it. But guys like you..." He paused. "Guys like you just do what needs doing and hate yourself for being good at it. That's supposed to help? No, just supposed to be true." Jack closed his eyes. Through the stone walls he could hear the distant rumble of artillery. The war grinding forward, mechanical and relentless as a watch spring unwinding. He thought about his father's shop in Kansas, about the quiet precision of fixing things, about how every broken watch was a puzzle with a solution if you just had patience and steady hands. War wasn't like that. War didn't get fixed. It just kept breaking new things. Battalion HQ occupied a requisitioned French manor house 4 miles behind the line. Jack had never been this far back before, never seen the world where officers moved, where radios crackled with information instead of screams, where the maps on the walls made the war look organized and logical. Captain Reeves looked exactly like Jack had imagined, mid-40s, prematurely gray eyes that had seen too much and filed it all away in neat mental folders. He sat behind a desk that had probably cost more than Jack's father made in a year. "Private Bigham." It wasn't a question. "Sir, let me see the rifle." Jack handed it over. Reeves examined the scope with the careful attention of a man who understood machinery. He traced the brass tube with one finger, tested the mounting bracket, peered through the optics. "You built this?" "Yes, sir." "From what exactly?" "Microscope lenses, German shell casing, scrap steel, field telephone wire." Reeves set the rifle down gently. "Lieutenant Harrow tells me you destroyed 3 German tanks with this. Range approximately 100-200 yards." "Yes, sir." "That's an extraordinary claim, Private." "It's an extraordinary scope, sir." Reeves almost smiled. Almost. "Walk me through it. How did you know it would work?" So Jack explained. About the focal lengths of the Zeiss lenses. About compensating for parallax. About the mathematics of bullet drop and windage. About testing on Red Hill and adjusting until the numbers matched reality. As he talked, Reeves took notes. Real notes in a leather journal with a fountain pen. When Jack finished, the captain set down his pen and studied him with new eyes. "You understand what you've done, don't you?" "Sir." "You've proven that standard issue equipment can be improved by soldiers in the field. That innovation doesn't require a laboratory or a factory. That sometimes the best ideas come from the men who actually have to use the tools." Reeves tapped the notebook. "That's dangerous thinking, Private." Jack's stomach dropped. "Sir, I didn't mean to..." "Dangerous," Reeves continued, "because it means the Army might have to admit it doesn't know everything." Now he did smile. "How would you like to teach others what you know?" They gave Jack a new assignment. Technical Instructor, Improvised Equipment Development. It was the kind of title that sounded important and meant almost nothing except it meant Jack wouldn't be storming bunkers or clearing trenches. Instead, he'd teach other soldiers how to adapt, modify, and improve their gear using whatever materials they could scavenge. The first class met in a barn outside Epernay. 12 soldiers, all of them marksmen or mechanics, all of them skeptical. Jack stood at the front, his homemade scope laid out on a wooden table beside the components he'd used to build it. He felt exposed, awkward. He'd never been good with crowds. "Most of you," he began, "think I got lucky. That I made something that worked once and probably won't work again. Nods. Crossed arms. One man, a sergeant with a Kansas City accent, said, "I heard you hit a fuel drum at over 1,000 yards. That's not skill. That's God smiling on you." "Maybe," Jack said. "But let me ask you something. How many rounds you think I fired on Red Hill before that shot?" The sergeant shrugged. 1020. 347. Silence. "I tested that scope every night for 2 weeks. Recorded every shot, every adjustment, every variable. Wind speed, temperature, humidity. I didn't get lucky. I eliminated luck from the equation." Jack picked up the brass tube. "This isn't magic. It's just physics. And physics doesn't care who you are or where you came from. It only cares if you do the work." The sergeant leaned forward. "Show us." So Jack did. He showed them how to identify quality lenses in abandoned equipment, how to calculate focal length using nothing but sunlight and a piece of paper, how to mount optics without specialized tools, how to test and calibrate and adjust until the numbers proved themselves true. By the end of the first session, 3 men had started sketching designs. By the end of the week, 2 had built working scopes of their own, crude, ugly, but functional. Davies showed up one afternoon with a battered pair of German binoculars. "Can you make a scope out of these?" Jack examined them. The right lens was cracked, but the left was perfect. "Yes." "How long?" 2 days, maybe 3. Davies grinned. "Hot damn TikTok. You know what this means? It means we don't have to wait on supply anymore. We can make our own." That was the moment Jack understood what Captain Reeves had meant about dangerous thinking. Because the Army ran on supply, on requisitions and paperwork, and waiting for equipment to trickle down from factories thousands of miles away. What Jack was teaching, what he'd proven on that frozen ridge, was that soldiers didn't have to wait. They could build it themselves. Word spread faster than orders. By March, soldiers from other companies were showing up at the barn bringing broken equipment and asking questions. "Can you fix this scope? Can you adapt this sight? Can you teach me how to do what you did?" Jack worked 18-hour days. His hands steady as ever, moved from project to project with the same precision he'd used on watches. But now, instead of fixing timepieces, he was fixing the way men saw war. One evening, a young private from Tennessee arrived with a rifle scope so fogged it was useless. "They're saying you can fix anything," the private said. "That true?" Jack took the scope, examined it under lamplight. The internal lenses had separated due to thermal shock. Fixable, but time-consuming. "I can fix it," Jack said, "but I can also teach you how to fix it yourself." "Why would you do that?" Jack looked at him. Really looked. The kid couldn't have been older than 19. Scared eyes, hands that shook slightly when he wasn't watching them. "Because one day, I might not be here," Jack said quietly. "And you'll still need to see clearly." The private nodded slowly. "Then teach me." They worked through the night, Jack explaining the private learning. By dawn, the scope was clear, and the kid knew how to repair the next one. As the private left, he turned back. "Hey, TikTok. Thanks for treating me like I got a brain instead of just a trigger finger." Jack watched him walk away into the gray morning light. For the first time since that shot on the ridge, the guilt eased slightly. Maybe Torres was right. Maybe he wasn't just breaking things. Maybe in some small way, he was still fixing them. April brought new orders. The company was moving east toward Germany. The war was accelerating, grinding toward some conclusion no one could quite see yet. Jack packed his tools, his homemade scope, his notebook full of designs and calculations. On the last night in Epernay, Davies found him in the barn. "Heard we're moving out tomorrow?" "Yeah." Davies held out something wrapped in cloth. "Made this. Figured you'd want it." Jack unwrapped it. A scope not as refined as his, but built using the same principles. Zeiss lenses from a captured rangefinder. Steel housing from a tank treadlink. Copper wire reticle. You made this yourself. You taught me. Davies shifted his weight. Look, I know I gave you shit when you first showed up with that thing. Called it junk, called you crazy. I was wrong. You weren't wrong. It is junk. No. Davies shook his head. Junk is something that doesn't work. What you made, what you taught us to make, that's something else. That's proof that we're not just cogs in a machine. That we can think. That we can adapt. That's... He trailed off, searching for words. That's survival, Jack finished. Yeah, that. They stood in the barn's dim light, two soldiers holding improvised scopes built from the wreckage of war. Outside engines rumbled as trucks loaded supplies. Tomorrow they'd move east toward new battles, new problems, new things that would break and need fixing. But tonight, in this moment, Jack understood something fundamental. Precision wasn't just about hitting targets. It was about showing men they were capable of more than anyone, including themselves, believed possible. The war had tried to break him into a killer. Instead, he'd become a teacher. And even in the midst of death and destruction, even when the cold bit through every layer and explosions lit the horizon, that small act of teaching, of sharing what he knew of treating men, like they had minds worth developing, mattered. Maybe it was the only thing that did. The convoy rolled east through villages that had forgotten their own names. Stone walls riddled with bullet holes, churches with missing steeples, fields that would grow nothing but rust and bones for years to come. Jack rode in the back of a supply truck, his rifle across his knees, watching France give way to Germany through gaps in the canvas. Beside him, Torres cleaned his weapon in silence. Across from them, Davies slept with his head against the truck bed, mouth open, exhausted. They crossed the Rhine on April 2nd, 1945. Jack marked it in his notebook, not because the date mattered strategically, but because crossing that river felt like crossing into something final. Germany was collapsing. Everyone could feel it. The question wasn't if the war would end, but how many more men would die before it did. "What are you writing?" Torres asked. Jack looked up from his notebook. "Calculations for the new scope design." "You're still thinking about scopes? War's almost over, TikTok." "Until it is, men still need to see." Torres shook his head, but didn't argue. By now, everyone in the company understood that Jack Bigham didn't stop working just because victory seemed inevitable. If anything, he worked harder, as if precision could somehow compensate for all the imprecision of war. The truck hit a pothole. Davies jerked awake, grabbing for his rifle, before he remembered where he was. "We there yet?" he mumbled. "Depends where you think there is," Torres said. Davies rubbed his eyes. "Anywhere that's not moving would be nice." But they kept moving. East, always east, following roads the Germans had retreated down days or hours before. Sometimes they passed civilians, old men, women, children, standing beside the rubble of their lives, watching American trucks roll past with expressions Jack couldn't read. Not quite hostile, not quite grateful, just hollow. Jack found himself thinking about his father's shop, about customers who'd bring in broken watches and explain apologetically that they couldn't afford much for the repair. His father would nod, fix the watch anyway, and charge half what it was worth. "Why?" Jack had asked once. "Why fix it if they can't pay proper?" His father had wound a mainspring carefully, evenly. Because a man without a working watch is a man who can't trust time anymore, and a man who can't trust time starts to drift. He'd looked at Jack over his reading glasses. Sometimes keeping people anchored is worth more than money. Jack hadn't understood then, but now, watching those hollow faces beside the road, he thought maybe he did. War had broken more than buildings. It had broken the mechanism by which people measured meaning. And no scope, no matter how precise, could fix that. They bivouacked in a captured German barracks outside Nuremberg on April 7th. The complex was huge rows of buildings designed to house thousands of soldiers, now mostly empty except for scattered companies of Americans and a few German prisoners waiting to be processed. Jack claimed a bunk in what had been an officer's quarters. The room still smelled like tobacco and leather. Someone had left a photograph on the windowsill, a German officer with his wife and 2 children, all of them smiling like the world made sense. Jack turned the photograph face down. That evening, Captain Reeves found him in the maintenance shed Jack had appropriated for his work. The captain looked older than he had 6 weeks ago. The gray in his hair had spread. The lines around his eyes had deepened. "Private Bigham." Jack stood. "Sir." "At ease." Reeves picked up one of the modified scopes from the workbench. "How many of these have you built now?" 17, sir. Another 8 in progress." "And you've trained how many men to build their own?" 43 have completed the full course. Maybe 20 more have learned enough to do field repairs." Reeves set down the scope carefully. "Do you know what they're calling you?" "In the other companies?" "No, sir." "The watchmaker. They say if your equipment's broken, find the watchmaker. He'll either fix it or teach you how to fix it yourself." Reeves paused. "That's good work, Private. Important work." "Thank you, sir. Which is why I need to ask you to do something difficult." Jack waited. In the captain's voice, he heard the same tone his father had used when a customer brought in a watch that was beyond saving regret mixed with necessity. "There's a facility," Reeves said slowly, "about 40 kilometers northeast of here, near a town called Ordruf. Advance units reached it 3 days ago. It's—" He stopped, started again. "It's not a military installation, it's something else. And we need someone with technical expertise to document what's there. Weapons equipment, anything that might be useful for intelligence." "Why me, sir?" "Because you see details other men miss. Because you document things precisely. And because—" Reeves met his eyes. "Because what's in that facility needs to be documented precisely. So no one can ever say it didn't happen." Something in the captain's voice made Jack's stomach tighten. "What kind of facility is it, sir?" Reeves didn't answer for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The kind we didn't know existed. The kind that changes what we thought this war was about." They drove to Ordruf the next morning. Jack, Lieutenant Harrow, a photographer named Weinstein, and 2 MPs. Nobody spoke much. Harrow had the map spread across his knees, but he wasn't looking at it. Just staring out the window at the German countryside rolling past, his jaw tight. Jack had never seen Harrow nervous before. The lieutenant had been calm under artillery fire, steady during firefights, unshakable when making decisions that meant life or death. But now his hands trembled slightly when he lit a cigarette. "Sir," Jack asked quietly, "what are we going to see?" Harrow took a long drag, exhaled smoke that was torn away by the wind. "I don't know, Bigham, but the major who briefed me last night—" He stopped. "This man fought in North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and when he described this place, he couldn't finish a sentence without stopping to compose himself. They smelled it before they saw it. A smell that didn't belong to war as Jack understood war. Not gunpowder or diesel or even the sharp copper of blood. This was something older, something wrong, a smell that made his body recoil instinctively the way you'd jerk your hand from a hot stove." Weinstein covered his mouth. "Oh, God." The truck slowed. Through gaps in the trees, Jack saw fence barbed wire, layer upon layer stretching between wooden posts. Guard towers with machine gun nests. And beyond the fence, Harrow's voice was hollow. "This is it. This is Ordruf." Jack would spend 4 days documenting that facility. 4 days that would fracture something inside him that precision and mathematics could never repair. The first thing they saw was the bodies. Not soldiers, not combatants. Just bodies stacked like cordwood beside a partially excavated pit, thin as anatomical diagrams, wearing striped uniforms that hung loose on skeletal frames. An American Lieutenant Jack didn't catch his name met them at the gate. His face was the color of old paper. "How many?" Harrow asked. "We've counted over 300 so far. Think there's more buried." The lieutenant's voice was flat, mechanical. The guards set fire to some of the buildings before they ran, tried to destroy the evidence. Evidence of what? The lieutenant just pointed toward the barracks. Jack followed Harrow inside. The photographer Weinstein started taking pictures, methodical professional, his camera clicking like a metronome, even as tears ran down his face. The barracks were worse than the bodies. Because the bodies were dead, finished beyond suffering. But the barracks, those showed how people had lived. Or tried to live. Wooden bunks stacked 3 high, so narrow, Jack couldn't imagine fitting his shoulders between them. Thin blankets that wouldn't stop wind, let alone cold. And everywhere, scratched into the wood, carved into walls, written in any substance that would make a mark, names. Hundreds of names. Thousands. They wanted to be remembered, Harrow whispered. They knew they might die here, and they wanted someone to know their names. Jack pulled out his notebook. His hand was shaking, but he forced it steady. Because Captain Reeves was right, this needed to be documented. Precisely. Completely. So no one could ever deny it existed. He started writing. Dimensions of the bunks. Number of prisoners per barracks. Estimated calories in the food rations they found, maybe 800 per day. Not enough to sustain life. Medical equipment in what passed for an infirmary, nearly nothing. Documents in the administrative building showing systematic record-keeping of who died when why. Causes of death listed as exhaustion, dysentery, heart failure, medical terms for murder by deliberate neglect. Bigham. Jack looked up. Harrow stood in the doorway of what had been the commandant's office holding a folder. You need to see this. The folder contained photographs. Not the kind Weinstein was taking documentation of atrocity. These were different. Progress reports. Before and after images. People photographed at arrival thin, but still recognizably human, then photographed again weeks later barely alive. And beneath each photo, handwritten notes in German. Numbers. Measurements. Like someone was conducting an experiment. They were testing, Harrow said. His voice was eerily calm now, the way men get when reality exceeds their capacity for emotional response. Testing how little food, how much work, how long until... He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Jack closed the folder carefully. His hands had stopped shaking. He felt cold now. Not the cold of winter in France. A different cold. The kind that came from understanding something fundamental about the world had been wrong. He'd thought war was about tactics and strategy, about one army against another, about men fighting for territory or ideology or survival. But this wasn't war. This was something else. Something that had been happening behind the front lines in facilities like this one, while soldiers fought and died believing they understood what they were fighting against. How many of these places are there? Jack asked. We don't know yet. Harrow set down the folder. Could be dozens. Could be more. Jack walked outside. He needed air, needed to breathe something that didn't carry that smell. He found himself standing beside the fence, looking at the guard tower, trying to understand the mechanics of it. How do you build a system like this? How do you organize the logistics of systematic murder? How many people does it take? How many orders? How many forms? How many ordinary decisions that add up to this hey TikTok? Torres had arrived with a supply truck. He started to smile, then saw Jack's face and stopped. You okay? Jack didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Because he wasn't okay, would never be okay again. Not in the way he'd been okay before walking through those gates. Torres followed his gaze to the barracks, to the stack of bodies, to the names carved into wood. Jesus Christ, Torres breathed. There's more, Jack said quietly. Buildings we haven't documented yet, mass graves we haven't excavated. And this is just one facility. There are others. They stood in silence. Around them, soldiers moved through the camp taking photographs, making lists, trying to impose order on something that defied comprehension. Finally, Torres said, Why are you here? Why'd they send you? To document. Captain Reeves said, "I see details other men miss." "And do you see details?" Jack thought about the folder in the commandant's office, about the photographs showing human beings reduced to data points, about the meticulous German record-keeping that treated murder like inventory management. "Yes," he said, "I see them. I see that whoever ran this place understood precision the same way I do. They understood systems, efficiency, optimization." He paused. They built a machine, and the machine's purpose was to erase people. Torres was quiet for a long moment. Then, "That's not the same as what you do. Isn't it? I build things that help men kill more efficiently, from farther away, with greater accuracy. That's different." "Is it?" "Yes." Torres grabbed his shoulder, forced Jack to look at him. "You know how I know, because you're standing here in this place, and it's breaking your heart. The bastards who ran this facility, this didn't break their hearts. This was their heart." Jack spent 3 more days at Ordroof. 3 days filling notebooks with measurements and observations, and carefully recorded horror. 3 days understanding that precision, his gift, his obsession, the thing that had saved lives on that frozen ridge, could also be twisted into something monstrous. On the last day, General Eisenhower came. Word spread through the camp like electricity. The Supreme Commander himself coming to see. Jack watched from a distance as Eisenhower walked through the barracks, his face carved from stone. Watched him examine the ovens where bodies had been burned. Watched him talk to the surviving prisoners, Polish, Russian, French, barely alive, barely able to stand. Later, Jack heard what Eisenhower had said to his staff. "We're told the American soldier doesn't know what he's fighting for. Now at least he'll know what he's fighting against." That night back at the barracks in Nuremberg, Jack couldn't sleep. He lay on his bunk staring at ceiling, his mind replaying everything he'd seen. The names carved in wood, the photographs in the folder, the systematic, precise, efficient machinery of murder. Around 0300 he got up, took his rifle, walked to the maintenance shed. His homemade scope lay on the workbench where he'd left it. Brass tube, salvaged lenses, copper wire crosshair. The thing that had started all of this, that had proven one man with ingenuity and precision could change outcomes. Jack picked it up, held it up to the single bare bulb. Through the optics, everything jumped into perfect focus. Clear, sharp, precise. He thought about smashing it, about taking a hammer and destroying this thing he'd built, this symbol of precision, turned toward death. Instead, he set it down carefully. Because Torres was right. The scope wasn't the problem. Precision wasn't the problem. The machine wasn't the problem. The problem was what you chose to build, what you chose to point it at, what you chose to make more efficient. Jack had built his scope to save lives, to keep men from having to charge into machine gun fire, to let them engage threats from distance, to give them an advantage that might mean they'd survive to go home. The people who built Ordroof had used the same skills, the same understanding of systems and efficiency to do the opposite. That was the difference. That was what mattered. Intent. Purpose. The choice of what to build and why. Jack pulled out his notebook. Started sketching a new design, not a weapon, but a tool. A portable periscope system that would let soldiers see over obstacles without exposing themselves. Another way to use precision to save lives instead of take them. He worked through the night, his hands steady, his mind focused on the only question that mattered anymore. Not, can I build this, but should I build this? And if the answer was yes, if the thing being built would help men survive, would reduce suffering, would tip the balance toward life instead of death, then he would build it with all the precision he possessed. Because precision itself was neutral, a tool, a lens that could magnify either creation or destruction. What mattered was the hand that held it and the heart that guided the hand. Dawn came. Jack was still working. Around him, the barracks woke to another day, men cleaning weapons, eating breakfast, preparing for whatever came next. Davies stopped by the shed, saw Jack hunched over the workbench, surrounded by sketches and calculations. You been up all night? Yeah. Working on what? Jack showed him the periscope design, explained how it would work, what materials they'd need, who it might save. Davies studied the sketches, nodded slowly. You know what I think, TikTok? I think you're trying to fix something that can't be fixed with tools. Maybe, but I have to try. Why? Jack thought about the names carved in wood, about the surviving prisoners who'd looked at Eisenhower with eyes that had seen the bottom of human capacity for cruelty, about the choice between using precision to destroy or using precision to save. Because if I don't, he said quietly, then what I saw at Ohrdruf wins. The machine wins. And I'll be damned if I let that happen. Davies put a hand on his shoulder, squeezed once, said nothing. Sometimes, silence was the only honest response. Outside, the sun rose over Germany. The war ground forward. Men died and others survived, and the line between the two remained razor-thin, determined by factors both random and planned. But in a maintenance shed in Nuremberg, a watchmaker from Kansas bent over his workbench and kept building. Kept trying to tip the balance. Kept believing that precision guided by conscience could matter. Even in a world that had built Ohrdruf, that belief had to matter. It was the only thing left that did. The war ended on May 8, 1945, but Jack Bigham didn't celebrate. He was in Munich when the announcement came over the radio. Germany's unconditional surrender, effective immediately. Around him, soldiers cheered, fired weapons into the air, embraced each other with the kind of desperate joy that comes from surviving something you thought might kill you. Jack sat on the steps of a bombed-out apartment building, his rifle across his knees, and felt nothing. Torres found him there, an hour later. Hey, TikTok, war's over. You hear me? It's over. I heard. Then why are you sitting here like someone died? Jack didn't answer right away. He was thinking about Ohrdruf, about the names carved in wood, about all the people who'd died in places like that who'd never hear that the war was over, never know their suffering had meant something. Because it's not over, Jack said finally. Not for them. Torres sat down beside him. They watched soldiers celebrate in the street, dancing, singing, passing bottles of liberated German wine. Victory looked exactly like Jack had imagined it would. Loud, messy, human. Captain wants to see you, Torres said. Said it's important. Captain Reeves had set up a temporary office in what had been a German administrative building. The walls were still covered with maps showing territories that no longer existed, borders that meant nothing now. Private Bigham. Reeves looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much knowledge for too long. Sit. Jack sat. The war in Europe is over, but our work isn't. Reeves pushed a folder across the desk. We're establishing documentation teams, medical personnel, photographers, engineers, people who can help us understand the full scope of what the Germans built, how many facilities, how many victims, how it all functioned. Jack opened the folder. Inside were photographs not from Ohrdruf, but from other places. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. Dozens of camps, each with the same architecture of systematic murder. Why are you showing me this, sir? Because you have a particular skill set. You see systems. You understand how things work. Reeves paused. And you document precisely. We need that precision. We need evidence that's so thorough, so detailed that no one can ever deny what happened here. Jack stared at the photographs. Part of him wanted to say no. Wanted to go home to Kansas, to his father's shop, to a world where the worst thing that could happen was a broken watch spring. But he thought about those names carved in wood, about the surviving prisoners who'd looked at Eisenhower with eyes that begged, "Remember us. Tell people what happened here." When do I start? Tomorrow. There's a facility near Mauthausen, Austria. Advance units liberated it 3 days ago. Initial reports say it's... Reeves stopped. It's bad, Bigham. Worse than Ordruff in some ways. How could it be worse? Reeves just shook his head. They drove to Mauthausen on May 10th. The same team Jack Harrow Weinstein, the photographer, 2 MPs. This time, they knew what to expect, or thought they did. But Mauthausen was different. It sat on a hill overlooking the Donau River built from stone blocks quarried by the prisoners themselves. The main camp was bad enough. Barracks gas chambers disguised as showers, crematorium ovens that had run day and night. But the quarry was something else entirely. They called them the Stairs of Death, a lieutenant from the Liberation Unit told them. 186 steps from the bottom of the quarry to the top. Prisoners had to carry stone blocks 50-60 pounds up those stairs. If they fell, the guards shot them. If they were too slow, the guards shot them. Some days hundreds of people died on those stairs. Jack looked down into the quarry. The stairs were granite worn smooth by countless feet. At the bottom, he could see dark stains that weren't from stone dust. Harrow stood beside him. How do we document this? How do we put this in a report? We count, Jack said quietly. We measure, we record, same as before. It's not the same. No, but it's all we can do. So Jack counted. He measured the stairs 186 steps, each one 14 inches high, 8 inches deep. He calculated the total elevation change, 227 feet. He estimated the weight of the stone blocks prisoners had carried, average 55 pounds, based on samples he examined. He documented the guard towers, the machine gun positions, the sight lines that ensured no one could escape without being shot. Mathematics. Precision. The only language he had for horror. But the numbers didn't capture everything. They couldn't capture the way the air felt in that quarry. The weight of knowing that thousands of people had died here, their suffering calibrated and optimized by men who understood efficiency as well as Jack did. On the third day, they found survivors. Not many. The Germans had evacuated most prisoners before the Americans arrived, forced them on death marches toward other camps. But a few had been too sick to move, left behind to die. Jack met one of them in what had been the camp infirmary. A Polish man named Janusz, 43 years old, but looking 70. He weighed maybe 90 pounds. His eyes were huge in his skeletal face. Through a translator, Jack asked questions. When did you arrive? What was the daily routine? How much food did they give you? How many prisoners were here at peak capacity? Janusz answered each question patiently, precisely. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but he wanted to talk, needed to talk. Why do you ask these questions? Janusz said finally. What does it matter now? Jack set down his pencil. Because people need to know what happened here, need to understand it completely, so it can never happen again. Janusz laughed. It was the saddest sound Jack had ever heard. You think understanding prevents repetition? No. Understanding only makes it easier to do it better next time. He pointed at Jack's notebook. Those men who built this place, they understood very well what they were doing. That was not the problem. Then what was? They understood, but they did not care. That is the problem. And your numbers, your measurements. Janusz tapped the notebook. Those cannot teach caring. Jack had no response to that. Because Janusz was right. All the documentation in the world, all the precise recording of atrocity, couldn't change the fundamental equation. Understanding didn't equal conscience. Knowledge didn't equal compassion. But it was still necessary. Because memory was the only defense against forgetting. And forgetting was what allowed this to happen again. I'm sorry, Jack said. It felt inadequate, but it was all he had. Janusz reached out with a trembling hand, touched Jack's arm. You are young. You still believe that truth matters. Keep that belief, even when evidence suggests otherwise. They finished documenting Mauthausen on May 15th. By then, Jack had filled 3 notebooks with measurements, calculations, observations. Weinstein had shot over 2,000 photographs. The MPs had collected documents, requisition forms, execution orders, meticulous German records of who died and when and why. On the drive back to Munich, nobody spoke. What was there to say? They'd done their job. They'd documented the evidence. They'd borne witness to something that defied comprehension but demanded remembering. Jack stared out the window at Austria rolling past. Spring had come while he wasn't paying attention. Trees were green. Fields were growing. The world was rebuilding itself with the kind of stubborn insistence that life always showed even in the aftermath of systematic death. "You okay?" Harrow asked. "No, sir." "None of us are." Harrow lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "I keep thinking about something my father told me. He was in the First War, saw terrible things at the Somme. When he came home, people would ask him what it was like. He'd say, 'I can tell you what happened, but I can't make you understand what it meant.' I never knew what he meant until now." Jack nodded. That was it exactly. He could document everything, every measurement, every number, every detail of how the machinery of murder had functioned. But documentation wasn't understanding. And understanding wasn't the same as knowing in your bones what it meant to stand in those places and breathe that air and look at those stairs and know that human beings had done this to other human beings with the same precision and efficiency Jack had used to build scopes. "What happens now?" Jack asked. Now we go home. Or we try to. Some of us will make it. Some of us won't." Harrow took a long drag. "I don't mean physically. I mean, some part of who we were before all this. That's what won't make it home." Jack's discharge papers came through on June 3, 1945. He was processed at a facility in Regensburg, given back pay and a train ticket to Hamburg, where a ship would carry him across the Atlantic to New York. The night before he left, Davies found him in the barracks. "Heard you're shipping out tomorrow." "Yeah." Davies sat on the bunk across from Jack's. They'd shared quarters for 18 months, survived battles and winters, and the slow grinding horror of advancing through a country that had built factories for murder. "What are you going to do when you get home?" Davies asked. Jack hadn't thought about it much. "Go back to my father's shop, I guess. Fix watches." Just like that, after everything. What else is there? Davies pulled something from his pocket. The scope he'd built using Jack's techniques, Zeiss lenses and shell casing housing and copper wire reticle. He held it out. "Keep this, so you remember." "Remember what?" "That what you taught us mattered. That you took the same skills those bastards used to build camps and you used them to save lives instead." Davies's voice was rough. "That might not seem like much. Might not balance the scales. But it's something. And something is better than nothing." Jack took the scope. It was heavier than he remembered. Or maybe he was just tired. "You really believe that it mattered?" "I'm alive because you taught me to fix my own equipment. So yeah, I believe it mattered." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, soldiers were celebrating. Still celebrating even weeks after victory, because the joy of not dying was slow to fade. "Hey, tick-tock," Davies said. "When you get home, when you're fixing watches and trying to forget all this, don't forget what you're capable of. Don't forget that your hands can build things that matter." Jack nodded, but he wasn't sure he wanted to remember what his hands were capable of, because capability was neutral. What mattered was intent. And after Ohrdruf, after Mauthausen, after seeing what happened when precision served cruelty instead of compassion, Jack wasn't sure he trusted his own intentions anymore. What if he was just one bad choice away from becoming like the engineers who'd built the camps? What if precision itself was dangerous because it amplified whatever purpose guided it? "I'll try," he said. It was all he could promise. The ship left Hamburg on June 5th. Jack stood at the rail watching Europe recede into the distance. 12 days of ocean, and then America. Home, Kansas. His father's shop. A world where the worst thing that happened was a broken spring or a worn gear. Torres appeared beside him, thinking about something profound. Thinking about how far away home seems. It's just 12 days. That's not what I mean. Torres understood. They all did. The men coming home weren't the same men who'd left. They'd seen things done, learned things about human nature that couldn't be unlearned. The gap between who they'd been and who they'd become was wider than the Atlantic. My uncle, Torres said, came back from the First War, never talked about it, just worked his job, raised his kids, lived a quiet life. I asked him once why he never told stories like the other vets. You know what he said? What? He said, "Some things you bring home, some things you leave in the mud, and the trick is knowing which is which." Jack thought about his notebooks. 3 of them filled with measurements and calculations and documentation of atrocity. Evidence that would be used in trials in history books in attempts to ensure that humanity remembered what it was capable of when conscience failed. "What if I don't know which is which?" Jack asked. "Then you bring it all home and figure it out later." Torres clapped him on the shoulder. "But whatever you do, don't bury it. Don't pretend it didn't happen, because that's how we forget, and forgetting is how it happens again." 12 days later, Jack stepped off the ship in New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty rose against the sky, her torch held high, her face serene. Around him, soldiers kissed wives and girlfriends, hugged parents, lifted children who barely remembered their fathers. Jack scanned the crowd looking for his father, there standing by a lamppost wearing the same suit he'd worn to church for 30 years. Their eyes met. His father started forward, stopped, started again. Like he wasn't sure how to approach this stranger who wore his son's face. They stood 3 feet apart. "You made it home," his father said. "Yes." Are you all right?" Jack thought about Ohrdruf, about Mauthausen, about the names carved in wood and the stairs worn smooth by dying feet, and the photographs showing human beings reduced to data points. "No," he said. "But I will be." His father pulled him into an embrace. Jack felt something break inside him, some wall he'd built to keep functioning, to keep documenting, to keep bearing witness without collapsing under the weight of what he'd seen. He cried against his father's shoulder, while around them America celebrated victory, without knowing the full cost of what victory had required. When Jack finally pulled back, his father held him at arm's length, studying his face. "Whatever you saw over there," his father said quietly, "whatever you did, you're still my son. And there's still a place for you at the workbench, when you're ready." "I don't know if I can fix watches anymore, Dad. Not after—" Jack stopped. "How did you explain Ohrdruf to someone who'd never seen it? How did you describe standing in a quarry where thousands died, measuring their suffering with the same precision you'd use to calibrate a scope?" "Then we'll figure out what you can fix," his father said. Together. They took the train to Kansas. Jack watched the country roll past fields and farms and small towns, all of them untouched by war, all of them innocent of what their soldiers had found in Europe. Part of him resented that innocence. Part of him was grateful for it. When they reached Salina, the town looked exactly as he'd left it. Main Street, the barber shop, the pharmacy, his father's watch repair shop with the same sign it had always had, Bigham & Son Precision Repairs. Jack stood outside looking at that sign. "I'm not sure I'm the same son who left," he said. "No one who goes to war comes back the same." His father unlocked the door. "But the workbench doesn't care who you were or who you've become. It only cares if you're willing to fix what's broken." Jack stepped inside. The shop smelled like machine oil and metal polish, and time the same smell he'd grown up with, the smell that meant home and safety and a world that made sense. His father's workbench sat in the corner, cluttered with tools and parts and watches in various states of repair. His own workbench, smaller, simpler, sat beside it exactly as he'd left it in September 1943. Jack set down his duffel bag. Inside were his notebooks, his discharge papers, and Davies's scope, the one piece of the war he'd chosen to bring home. He pulled out the scope, held it up to the light. Through the salvaged lenses, the shop jumped into focus, every tool in sharp relief, every detail clear and precise. His father watched quietly. "What is that?" "Something I built, in France, to help men see clearly from far away." "Did it work?" Jack thought about the Panzer exploding, about the 3 tanks destroyed, about the 43 men he'd taught to build their own equipment to fix what was broken, to adapt and survive. Then he thought about Ordruff, about precision serving cruelty, about how the same skills that saved lives could also systematize death. "Yes," he said, "it worked, but I'm not sure that's enough." His father picked up a broken pocket watch from his workbench. The kind of everyday repair that had filled their lives before the war, a worn mainspring, nothing exotic, just something that needed patient attention. "You know what I learned in 50 years of fixing watches," his father said, "that working isn't the same as mattering. Every tool works if you use it properly, but whether it matters depends on what you're fixing and why." He handed Jack the watch. "So the question isn't whether your scope worked. The question is, did it fix something that needed fixing?" Jack held the watch in one hand, the scope in the other. 2 kinds of precision, 2 ways of seeing. One designed to keep time, the other designed to take it. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I saved some lives, but I couldn't save all of them. And the people who needed saving most, the ones in the camps, I couldn't reach them in time." His father nodded slowly. "Then maybe that's what you fix next, not with scopes or weapons, but with whatever tools you have. Because fixing things is what we do, Jack. It's who we are. And just because we can't fix everything doesn't mean we stop trying." Jack set down the scope, picked up his tools, tweezers, screwdrivers, the jeweler's loop he'd carried through France and Germany and Austria. He sat at his workbench, the broken watch before him, and began to work. His hands were steady, his vision was clear, and for the first time since Ordruff, since Mauthausen, since standing in places that proved humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty, Jack Bigham felt something that might eventually become peace. Not because he'd forgotten what he'd seen, not because the horror had faded, but because he understood finally what his Uncle Torres had meant about knowing what to bring home and what to leave in the mud. He'd bring home the precision, the belief that details mattered, the understanding that building something right could make a difference, even if it couldn't solve everything. But he'd leave behind the guilt. The weight of thinking his skills were somehow contaminated by what others had used similar skills to create. The fear that capability itself was dangerous, because capability was just a tool. What mattered, what had always mattered, was the choice of what to build and why. Outside, the sun set over Kansas. Inside, a watchmaker repaired a broken timepiece with the same steady hands that had once built a scope from salvaged parts and saved lives at 200 yards. Freedom had come to Europe, but it had come too late for thousands, for all those names carved in wood, all those people who died before liberation, all those who disappeared into camps that operated with the same precision Jack had used to fix watches and build scopes and document atrocity. Their absence would haunt him forever, but their memory-precise, documented witnessed would endure. And that, Jack told himself as he worked, would have to be enough. The first watch Jack repaired after coming home belonged to Mrs. Henderson from 3rd Street. She brought it in on a Tuesday morning, apologizing for bothering him so soon after his return. "The second hand keeps sticking," she said. "My husband gave me this watch before he passed. I know it's silly, but it's not silly." Jack took the watch carefully. "When do you need it back?" "Oh, whenever you have time. I know you must be busy, what with just getting home and all." Jack opened the case right there at the counter. The problem was obvious, a bent pivot on the second-hand's arbor, probably from being dropped. 5 minutes of careful work with tweezers and a burnisher, and the hand moved freely again. Mrs. Henderson stared. "That's it. You fixed it." Yes, ma'am. But you didn't even take it to the back. You just... She stopped. How much do I owe you? Nothing. Welcome home present to myself. She tried to argue, but Jack was already turning to the next customer. Because staying busy meant not thinking, not remembering, not seeing names carved in wood every time he closed his eyes. His father watched from his workbench, but said nothing. Just went back to his own repairs, giving Jack the space to figure out how to be a watchmaker again. But that night, after they'd closed the shop, his father set down his tools. You can't outrun it by working. Jack didn't look up from the movement he was cleaning. I'm not running. Then what are you doing? Trying to fix things. Like you said. Jack. His father waited until Jack met his eyes. You've repaired 14 watches today. Perfectly. Efficiently. But you haven't said more than 10 words to any customer. You haven't smiled once. You're working like a machine, not like my son. Jack set down the movement. His hands were shaking again, something that happened more often now when he wasn't actively focusing on keeping them steady. I don't know how to be your son anymore. Then be whoever you are now. But be present. Be here. Don't just go through the motions. The motions are all I have. His father was quiet for a long moment. Then, your mother, before she died when the cancer was bad, she told me something. She said, the hardest part of dying isn't leaving. It's watching you try to fix something that can't be fixed. I didn't understand then, but I think I do now. Jack looked at his hands. Steady now. Capable. The same hands that had built a scope, documented atrocities, measured suffering with mathematical precision. What if I can't be fixed? Then you don't get fixed. You just keep going anyway. That's what living is. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. Official military stationery postmarked from Washington, D.C. Jack opened it at the kitchen table while his father made coffee. The letter was from the Judge Advocate General's office. They were preparing for war crimes trials, Nuremberg they were calling them. Prosecutors needed witnesses. People who could testify about what they'd seen in the camps. People whose documentation was thorough enough to stand up to cross-examination. They want me to come testify, Jack said. His father poured 2 cups of coffee. Do you want to go? No. Are you going to? Jack stared at the letter. Part of him wanted to burn it to pretend he'd never received it, to bury himself in watch repairs and never think about Europe again. But he thought about Janos at Mauthausen weighing 90 pounds, saying, keep that belief. Even when evidence suggests otherwise. He thought about the names carved in wood. Yes, Jack said. I'm going to. Nuremberg in November 1945 was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The city was rubble-bombed flat by Allied aircraft, then occupied, then converted into a courtroom, where the survivors would try to prove that justice still meant something. Jack arrived 3 days before he was scheduled to testify. They put him up in a requisitioned hotel with other witnesses, doctors, soldiers, civilians, who'd been liberated from camps. At night, they sat in the hotel bar and didn't talk about why they were there. Just drank and played cards and pretended they were normal people doing normal things. On the second night, Jack met a woman named Rachel Levy. She was 32 but looked 50. She'd survived Auschwitz, a name Jack had heard, but whose full horror he was only beginning to understand. You're the one who documented the camps, she asked. Some of them. Ohrdruf, Mauthausen. Why? So people would know what happened. Rachel laughed bitterly. You think people don't know they know, they just don't want to believe. Then we make them believe. With what numbers, photographs? She shook her head. I can tell them I watched my mother walk into a gas chamber. I can describe the smell of burning bodies. I can show them the number tattooed on my arm, and they'll nod and take notes and file it away like it's just another story. Because that's what people do with horror, they file it away so they don't have to feel it. Jack had no response. Because she was right. He'd seen it already, the way people looked away when he mentioned the camps. The way conversations changed subjects. The way even other veterans would say, "Yeah, we heard about that. Terrible business. Anyway." "So why testify?" he asked. Rachel finished her drink. "Because the alternative is letting them pretend it never happened, and that's worse than being filed away." Jack testified on November 23, 1945. The courtroom was massive benches for judges, prosecution, defense, press observers. And in the dock, wearing suits and expressions of careful neutrality, sat men who'd built and operated the machinery of systematic murder. The prosecutor, an American colonel named Williams, led Jack through his testimony step by step. "Where were you stationed? What did you observe at Ohrdruf? What about Mauthausen? Can you describe the facilities, the conditions, the evidence you documented?" Jack answered each question precisely. He referenced his notebooks, all three of them, now filed as evidence exhibits. He explained the measurements, the calculations, the systematic documentation of how the camps had functioned. The defense attorney, a German lawyer appointed to represent the accused, cross-examined carefully. "Private Bigham, you're a watchmaker by training, correct?" "Yes." "Not a medical examiner, not a forensic specialist?" "No." "So your conclusions about cause of death, about the number of victims, about the operation of these facilities, those are just educated guesses, aren't they?" Jack met the lawyer's eyes. "No, they're documented observations." "But you can't be certain." "I measured the ovens in the crematorium at Mauthausen. Based on their dimensions and fuel capacity, I calculated they could process approximately 60 bodies per day. The German records we recovered showed they ran 24 hours a day for 18 months. That's not a guess. That's mathematics." The courtroom was silent. The defense attorney tried again. "But you weren't there during the camp's operation. You only saw the aftermath. You can't testify to what actually happened." "I can testify to what I saw," Jack interrupted. His voice was steady, but something in it made even the judges lean forward. "I saw stairs worn smooth by people carrying stones until they died. I saw barracks designed to hold 200 that held 800. I saw names carved in wood by people who knew they might die and wanted someone to remember them. I saw ovens built to burn bodies efficiently. I saw documents, German documents written by German officers that recorded every death with the same precision I used to fix watches. So no, I wasn't there during the operation, but the evidence was, and evidence doesn't lie." The defense attorney sat down. He had no follow-up questions. After his testimony, Jack was free to leave, but he stayed for 2 more days, sitting in the gallery watching other witnesses testify. Rachel Levy took the stand and described Auschwitz with the kind of calm that only came from having cried all the tears you had years ago. A Polish doctor testified about medical experiments. A German officer who'd defected described the bureaucracy of genocide, the paperwork, the requisitions, the efficiency reports. On the final day, Jack sat next to an older man, maybe 60, with white hair and trembling hands. The man didn't testify, just watched. During a recess, Jack asked, "Are you a witness?" "I was. I testified yesterday." The man's accent was French. "My name is Claude Rousseau. I was at Ohrdruf." Jack turned to look at him. Really look. "You were a prisoner." "For 14 months. Until the Americans came." Claude pulled up his sleeve, showing the striped uniform tattoo. "I was one of the lucky ones. I lived." "I documented Ohrdruf," Jack said quietly. "In February, I saw the barracks, the names on the walls." "Did you see mine, Claude Rousseau?" "I carved it on the 3rd bunk from the door." Jack tried to remember. He'd photographed hundreds of names, recorded them in his notebook, but individual details had blurred together. "I don't know. Maybe." "It doesn't matter." Claude's hands shook as he lit a cigarette. "You saw, you recorded. That's what matters. Because now when they say it didn't happen, and they will say that in 10 years, 20 years, there will be evidence. Photographs. Measurements. Testimony. Truth that can't be erased. You think truth is enough? Claude smiled sadly. No, but it's all we have. They sat in silence while the trial resumed. On the stand, another witness described another camp. Another system of murder built with the same precision Jack had once admired. And Jack understood something he'd been circling around since Ohrdruf, since Mauthausen, since coming home. The problem wasn't precision. The problem was that precision could serve any master. It could save lives or take them. It could document atrocity or commit it. The tool itself was neutral. What mattered, what had always mattered, was the choice. And he'd made his choice. At that frozen ridge in France, when he'd built a scope to help men survive. In those barracks and quarries, when he'd documented what he'd found so it couldn't be denied. Here in this courtroom, when he'd testified instead of running home to Kansas and pretending it had never happened. He'd chosen to use his precision in service of life, of truth, of memory. That choice wouldn't balance the scales, wouldn't resurrect the dead, wouldn't erase what he'd seen. But it was something. And something, as Davies had said, was better than nothing. Jack returned to Kansas on December 2, 1945. His father met him at the train station again, but this time Jack didn't cry. Just hugged him and said, "I'm ready to work now, really work." They walked to the shop together. Main Street was decorated for Christmas lights and wreaths and a sense of normalcy that felt both alien and comforting. Inside the shop, Jack's workbench waited exactly as he'd left it. But before he sat down, Jack pulled Davies' scope from his bag. He'd carried it to Nuremberg and back, this reminder of what precision could build when guided by conscience. "What are you going to do with that?" his father asked. Jack considered. He could keep it as a souvenir. He could mount it on the wall. He could bury it in a drawer and try to forget it existed. Instead, he set it on the shelf behind the counter where customers could see it. "I'm going to keep it here, as a reminder." Of what? That tools are just tools. That what matters is what you build and why. Jack picked up his jeweler's loupe, his tweezers, his screwdrivers, the tools of his trade, the instruments of precision. And that building things that matter is the only response to a world that sometimes builds things that destroy. His father nodded slowly. "Then let's build." The years passed. Jack fixed watches and trained apprentices and lived a quiet life in Kansas. He married a teacher named Sarah in 1947. They had 2 daughters. He taught them about precision and patience and the importance of fixing what was broken. Sometimes late at night, he'd still see the names carved in wood. Still smell that smell from Ohrdruf. Still hear Rachel Levy's voice saying, "They know. They just don't want to believe." But he'd also remember Claude Rousseau's smile. Remember Janusz at Mauthausen saying, "Keep that belief." Remember his father saying, "Building things that matter is the only response." In 1963, a young reporter from the Kansas City Star came to interview him. The Army had recently declassified documents about the scope program Jack had started in France, the improvised equipment development that had saved lives and changed how soldiers thought about adapting their gear. "Did you know," the reporter asked, "that your techniques are still being taught, that the Army's field manual on equipment modification cites you by name?" Jack didn't know. He'd left all that behind when he came home. "They're calling you an innovator, a pioneer of battlefield adaptation." The reporter flipped through his notes. "But what's interesting is what some of the men you trained said. They said you didn't just teach them to build scopes, you taught them to think differently, to see themselves as capable of more than they believed." Jack thought about that, about the 43 men he'd trained, about Davies and Torres, and all the others who'd learned that precision wasn't about following orders, it was about understanding principles and adapting them to reality. "I just showed them what they already had," Jack said. "Everyone has the capacity to fix things, to build things, to make things better. They just need someone to prove it's possible." "And what about you?" the reporter asked. "What did you prove?" Jack looked at the shelf where Davies' scope still sat 23 years after the war ended. He thought about Ohrdruf and Mauthausen and Nuremberg. about the choice between using precision to serve life or death, about how that choice repeated over and over defined not just what you built, but who you became. I proved that you can look at the worst things humanity is capable of, Jack said slowly, and still choose to build something better. Jack Bigham died in 1987 at the age of 64. Heart attack quick and clean. His funeral was attended by family friends, customers whose watches he'd fixed, former soldiers he'd served with. At the reception, Davies, now white-haired and retired, stood to speak. Jack never talked much about the war, Davies said. Never bragged about that shot at 200 yards, never mentioned the tanks he destroyed, never told people about the scope that everyone said was impossible. But he changed how I saw the world. He taught me that impossible just means nobody's figured out how yet. That precision isn't about perfection. It's about caring enough to get the details right. And that building something useful, something that helps people, is the best response to a world that sometimes builds things that hurt them. Davies pulled out the scope, the original one Jack had built in that French cellar, the one that had started everything. He'd kept it all these years, carried it through battles, brought it home, preserved it as a reminder. "This thing is ugly," Davies said, holding it up. "Brass tube, salvaged lenses, bent steel mounting bracket. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. Because Jack Bigham understood something fundamental, that what you build matters less than why you build it. And he built this to save lives, to help men survive, to prove that we're capable of more than the worst things we do." He set the scope on the table beside Jack's photograph. "So, here's to the watchmaker. Who fixed more than watches? Who built more than scopes? Who proved that precision guided by conscience can change the world one careful adjustment at a time." Today, Davies's scope sits in a small military museum in Salina, Kansas. The brass tube is tarnished now, the mounting bracket rusted. But through the Zeiss lenses, the world still jumps into perfect focus, clear, sharp, precise. Beside it, a placard reads, "Built in winter, 1945, by Private Jack Bigham, 4th Infantry Division. Used to destroy 3 German Panzer tanks at ranges exceeding 200 yards. Later used to train over 40 soldiers in improvised equipment modification. Symbolizes the principle that precision guided by conscience serves life rather than death." And beneath that, in smaller letters, a quote from Jack's testimony at Nuremberg. "Evidence doesn't lie, but evidence needs witnesses. People who will look at the truth even when it's horrible, especially when it's horrible, and say, 'I saw this. I recorded this. I will not let this be forgotten.'" Visitors to the museum sometimes ask about the scope, about how it worked, why it mattered, what it meant. The curator, Jack's granddaughter, a woman who never met him but inherited his steady hands, explains patiently. "My grandfather believed that fixing things was a moral act," she says. "That taking what's broken and making it work again, whether it's a watch or a rifle scope or a person's faith in humanity, that's how we resist darkness. Not with grand gestures, but with small acts of precision and care repeated over and over until they add up to something that matters." She adjusts the scope slightly on its stand, making sure visitors can see through the lenses. He saw terrible things in the war. Things that showed him what humanity is capable of when precision serves cruelty. But instead of giving up on precision, he chose to use it differently. To build instead of destroy. To document instead of deny. To teach instead of retreat. Through the window, Kansas stretches away under an endless sky. Somewhere out there, people are building things, some good, some bad, most somewhere in between. And somewhere, someone is choosing what to build and why. That choice, repeated across millions of lives, millions of moments, determines what kind of world we live in. Jack Bigham understood that, proved it with a homemade scope and steady hands, testified to it at Nuremberg, lived it in a watch repair shop for 40 years. He built his tools from salvaged parts. But the legacy he built, that was precision itself. Not in service of destruction, but of memory, of truth, of the stubborn belief that fixing what's broken matters even when the breaking seems endless. They laughed at the watchmaker's scope. But the watchmaker had the last word. And that word, carved in brass and glass and conscience, still speaks to anyone willing to look through the lens and see clearly. Build what matters. Document what's true. Remember what happened. Choose every day to use your precision in service of life, rather than death. That choice won't fix everything,